Welcome. My name is Carlos Diaz-Rocio. I'm the founding director of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, and this is our first event of the fall semester, our first in-person event of the fall semester. So thank you for being here. I want to begin the way I usually begin these events by telling you a little bit about the center. It's a young center, so not a lot of people know about what we do. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes to let you know what we do, and then I have the distinct pleasure of introducing this amazing cohort of senior leadership fellows, the third cohort that we're welcoming to the Adam Smith Center. Working at the intersection of public policy and the free market, the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom wants to position itself as a world-class, independent, nonpartisan think tank that aims to inform, influence, and inspire current and future leaders to develop and implement innovative, meaningful, and effective public policies to advance individual freedom and human prosperity. As some of you may know, we were created a couple of years ago by the legislature and the governor of Florida to harness the power of rigorous research to offer a better understanding of the free enterprise system and its impact on individual freedom and human prosperity. Around the world, we're a truly global center, but obviously because we're in Miami, we so far have focused a little bit more on the United States and Latin America. Through our activities and programs, the center hopes to inspire and enlighten policy discussions, analysis, and decision-making. The way I look at it, we have four main pillars in what we do. First, to do what all think tanks, and it's really not a think tank, but a think and do tank, because we really emphasize the theory and the practice. So we do what all think tanks do. We do research. We want to do rigorous research on important public policy issues, publish that research, make it available to everyone. Second, to educate, to mentor, to inspire. And the way I look at it, the crown jewel of this pillar is what we're celebrating today, the Senior Leadership Program, which is an amazing program. This is the third semester. It's a program that brings to the center 3 or 4 top-level public servants, individuals who have served at the highest levels of government, to come to FIU for 3 months to teach, to mentor, to inspire. As part of the teaching mission, they teach study groups, we call them. These are not-for-credit classes, if you will, where they have interaction with our students. They're small by design, so you can get to know them, so you can realize that he may be president, but he's a real man who is willing to share his experiences with the students. Same for the vice president, same for the ambassador. And so I look at it as a crown jewel because we bring top-level individuals to mentor the next generation of leaders. 3, do public events, just like this one. We've done about 18 public events over the past year, events where we bring in top-level people to discuss issues, always to have a meaningful and thoughtful debate, a civil debate. And 4th, we're not there yet, but eventually we want to do consulting for governments, or perhaps even corporations, so that if you're the president of a country or the mayor of a city or a legislator, and you're thinking about implementing a specific regulation or raising taxes or lowering taxes, you come to us for data, for objective analysis. The decision maker makes the decision, but we can provide you with analysis so you can make a more informed decision. In a nutshell, that's what we do. And we're super, super excited to be able to welcome all of you and to welcome this amazing cohort of fellows to the university. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly. We can be here all afternoon talking about their many accomplishments, but you want to hear from them, not from me. So I'm going to be very brief, tell you a couple of sentences about what they've done, and then I'm going to ask each of them to briefly tell you something about them and to sort of give a couple of minutes of introductory remarks, and then I'm going to ask 2 or 3 questions of each of them, a couple of questions of the whole panel, and then I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'm going to ask if the students could go first in the Q&A session. So I'm going to begin with President Iván Duque, who, as you know, is not only a Colombian politician, but a statesman, an author. He was president of the Republic of Colombia from 2018 until just 5 weeks ago, 5.5 weeks?
6 weeks.
6 weeks, almost 6 weeks, but who's counting? Before that, he was senator of the Republic from 2014 to 2018. And before that, he was a senior advisor for Colombia at the Inter-American Development Bank and worked in Colombia's finance and public credit ministry. He has published many, many books. And again, I could be here all afternoon telling you about his accomplishments. We also have Vice President Guevara, who served as Vice President of the Republic of Honduras from 2014 until 2018, and was the first ambassador of her country to Italy from 2010 to 2011, and then ambassador to Brazil from 2011 to 2012. Before that, she had a long and award-winning career as a journalist. And she'll be talking a lot about the intersection between journalism and public service. And then we have a good friend, Ambassador Paula Dobrianski, who is really one of the world's leading experts on so many issues. And we're going to get to hear a little bit about that. She was in the State Department as Undersecretary of State for 8 years, from 2001 until 2009. And during that time as well, she was the head of the delegation and lead negotiator on U.S. climate change policy and the President's envoy, President Bush's envoy, to Northern Ireland. And she has many other jobs in the government. I won't list them all, but I'm going to highlight Director of European and Soviet Affairs at the National Security Council and Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. And of course, her study group will be on the U.S. foreign policy, navigating the U.S. foreign policy making mess that it is, a fascinating mess. So I'm going to turn it over to them. I'm going to ask if they can just give you a couple of minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll hit them with questions. President Duque?
Well, thank you so much, Carlos. It's a great honor for me, Vice President Guevara, and also Paula, Ambassador Dobriansky. We have been friends for a long, long time. It's a great honor for me to be here at FIU at this incredible center that tries to connect, and it's aimed to connect two elements of thought: the defense of the free economy and the defense of democracy. So I think that focus is something that we're going to deeply concentrate, and I am very happy to be here sharing with students one approach, and it is to connect theory and practice. So we had a long conversation with Carlos about how should we connect the classes or the seminars that we will have with students, and I definitely want to put a focus in the VUCA world or VUCA world that we live, which is a world of volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, and how democracy is threatened by phenomena like polarization, post-truth, and populism, and how in that such a complex environment, we had to deal with things like the largest migration crisis in this hemisphere, how we dealt with the pandemic, and how we had to make decisions with clear uncertainty and with the complexity of not having the availability of many of the solutions because the world decided to close at a moment where we all were desperately looking for resources. How do we dealt with the first hurricane category 5 in a country like Colombia? And how we also had to put together all the policies to get the economy growing again and be able to attend many of the social needs in a country like Colombia, but also putting this in a broader context. And as I have said many times, the interesting thing about the class and the seminar is that all questions are open. There's no restriction to ask absolutely anything. And that obviously, as I have said many times, the most important thing is not to read leadership books, not written by people who have exercised leadership, because there's a lot of theory, but you want to know also the practice and the complexities and the things that are not written anywhere, and the human sentiments behind the decision making. So I hope to give my best in this process, and I just want the students to have the possibility to get behind the scenes in all the decisions that were taken in Colombia, and that I have to say that at least as a human being have left me with one precious achievement, which was to leave the country reaching the highest growth in its history last year, to be able to vaccinate the whole country and rank #1 in the resilience index in the management of the pandemic in Latin America, and achieve the largest expansion of the social safety net in Colombia. So this is not to brag, this is just to say we want to be able to share all these lessons with you and be able to be challenged by the questions. because what I will appreciate the most is to have as much challenging questions as possible from the students. So thank you so much, Carlos.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam Vice President?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Diaz, Your Excellencies, President Duque. It's an honor, really, for me to be part of this prestigious program of Seniors Fellows of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom of the Florida International University. I congratulate Mr. Diaz, the Adam Smith Center, for cultivating the culture of freedom in the world. Many freedoms are under risk and probably risk of disappearing. And all new leaders, you all students, must be aware of this situation, of this critical situation, I would say, so that when you get the opportunity of leading any task in your countries or in this country, you will know how to protect the most important gift for humanity, which is freedom. I thank the Adam Smith Center for giving me the opportunity of sharing my experiences, but also Latin American experiences compared to developed countries, and learning from the knowledge that FIU has given you all. And I hope you are all willing to come to my lectures and enrich them. It is very important that we understand our past. We know our past to understand our present. And this will make us work hard to better our future. And it will be your responsibility. So you're more than welcome to all of our lectures, and we really expect for you to enrich them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ambassador?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm thoroughly delighted to be here today and to be a fellow and to also share this particular, as you said, cohort with the president and vice president. It truly is an honor. And I also want to congratulate you, Carlos, because far too often in foreign policy and dealing with national security, I have found that economics is an afterthought. And in here, you have it front and center, and it's absolutely crucial and essential in terms of looking at national security questions, foreign policy questions, and I'm very excited about the road ahead for this semester. My study group will be focused on navigating U.S. foreign policy decision-making, and towards that end, it will be very practically oriented. In fact, one of the things that I wanted to find out from the students, are they in fact on the road to becoming budding diplomats? And some of them indeed are. And so towards that end, one has to address what are some of the most challenging issues that one has to confront in being a diplomat? Issues of like dealing with dictators, thinking about the countries of Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, but also how do you manage media? You know, media is a tough road, and especially when things might not be accurately reported, well, what do you do about it? And then the issue of Congress. How does Congress factor in terms of foreign policy decision-making? I know when I worked at the State Department, my own attitude was, my gosh, we have to deal with every single member of Congress and what he or she wants to put forward to the department in terms of a particular foreign policy path or course. I had the privilege of, at a young age, actually 24, in working in the Reagan White House. And I say that because I hope to also inspire the young students here that they too should have no barriers. Age should not be a barrier. They should go forward and achieve what is their dream, their vision, and be effective and contribute. And that's the exciting part for me of the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, that everyone who's part of these study groups, I think, will grow, will learn, and actually will do really impactful things that will make an absolutely real substantive backdrop to and meaning to the center and the center's work. So let me say I'm just very pleased to be here and look forward to hearing many of your questions and comments and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. And I want to begin with you. As I mentioned at the beginning, I see ourselves as a truly global center, but so far most of the work has focused on the United States and on Latin America. And one of the many reasons why we're so thrilled to have you is because you also bring in not only expertise in U.S. foreign policy making and Latin America and all those good things, but also in an area of the world that is in the news on a daily basis, Ukraine and Russia. So I want to ask you about your thoughts on what's happening right now, and why should people in the United States, in Miami, care about this awful war in Ukraine?
First, let me say I am very proud. My entire family on my mother's and father's side all immigrated to the United States from Ukraine. So I have a very solid Ukraine background, and I'm very proud of my heritage. I would start with the situation in Ukraine and the Russia's war on Ukraine is not only a tragedy, but it's horrific. It's horrific in this day and age and cannot be accepted in any corner of this earth. What we are witnessing is literally an aggression and an assault on the Ukrainian culture, an attempt to actually obliterate Ukraine so it doesn't exist anymore. And that is what Putin, his goal and his objective is pure and simple. There have been attempts at negotiation, and not one single attempt has worked. Earlier on, there was an attempt to set up humanitarian corridors. Nothing happened. Then there was an attempt to also try to bring out Ukrainians out of certain cities that were being heavily bombarded. They were not able to achieve that. People had to escape. And then, of course, now we witness the blockade of grain and food. And in this sense, it's not just the Middle East region that's affected. Countries like Egypt, which relies about 75% on that grain. But quite frankly, the global community is in fact and indeed impacted here. And so it is unacceptable. It is absolutely unacceptable. And then you also have the threats. So what comes next? I happen to be actually part of a bipartisan group of Republicans, Democrats, independents that's affiliated with an institution in Washington, D.C., the Atlantic Council. And actually, we've signed a number of statements. And our statements have been very focused on several things. One, that we, the United States, should really have a clear articulation of our goal. And that goal is a success, a victory for Ukraine, 100% in this case. Secondly, that there should also be, when a time comes, security guarantees that are also provided to Ukraine going forward. Thirdly, the group does not accept the notion that we have to be concerned about escalation. Sorry to say, I read the news today that says that Putin again is threatening one action, another action. Quite frankly, since February 24, he's been making a variety of threats. Solidarity of purpose, and not just from the West, but from Asia and for all those countries that are united behind Ukraine's goals and objectives, here is crucial. Providing military assistance is absolutely crucial, and that is front and center. And I happen to be also a co-chair of a commission that's focused on Ukraine's reconstruction. That's also very crucial because there's an opportunity here to provide the kind of basis for Ukraine going forward, economic basis for Ukraine going forward, which will have ramifications not just for the region and not just for the United States, but actually for the global supply chain. I'll end on this note, and that is, I thought back historically about this course of events. And I thought back on the invasion in 2014. At that time, there was the illegal annexation of Crimea, and there was also the invasion of the Donbas region. The reason I mention it to you because Ukrainians remember two vital things at the time. The West did not want to give them any arms. No arms were rendered to Ukraine. They only had old kind of Soviet type material and equipment. But the second factor was that they also indicated they wanted to fight. There actually was a discouragement towards that end. And you know why they were discouraged? Because there was a concern about escalation. I just state that because that was 2014, and I think that here Putin has been relentless in terms of his goal and objective. He's not going to cease and desist, and we have to be relentless in terms of ensuring that there is a victory on the right side of this, because it has ramifications for all of us, not just Ukraine.
Now, what's happening in Honduras is not as horrific, obviously, as what's happening in Ukraine, but we've seen a serious deterioration of democracy in Honduras. So I'll ask the Vice President the same question: why should we care about what's happening in your country? You served in a government where the president is now behind bars in the United States, where the current administration is making a sharp turn to the left and showing signs of authoritarianism. Why should we care?
Well, Honduras geographically is located right at the heart of the American continent. So I think it's very important, especially for its best ally, which is the United States, to support our country, especially from the weakening of the democracy and the violence that the organized crime has pushed inside the country. It's like a monster. Sorry. It's like a monster with 1,000 heads. And Honduras by itself will never win this battle. I consider that there has to be great support in the country. There's uncertainty at this moment. In January, the first woman in history won the elections. However, these elections she won them because she made an alliance, Xiomara Castro de Zelaya. There was an alliance with another presidential candidate who's Salvador Nasrallah. It's a moderate left and a center right candidate. People went to the ballots and voted for this alliance. The problem is that the perception of the people now is that her husband, who was the president that was overthrew on 2009, Manuel Zelaya Rosales, apparently he's the one who's controlling the government. And this is very disappointing for the people because they said that they voted for a president, a woman president, the first woman president in history. Up to this moment, also the perception in my country is that the government hasn't started to act, especially when they received a country in total economic crisis, social crisis. Honduras has been located as the second poorest country in America, in the Caribbean. And that is why it is very important for Honduras to get support from all its friends because there are some other parties, some other countries, for example, China, that are trying to have their own control or presence in the continent. Everybody knows what has happened in many Central American countries. First, they were allies with Taiwan, and now China is pushing to have a better or stronger presence in the continent, and Honduras is not the exception. So that is why it is very important for us win the battle against organized crime, narco-traffic, also to preserve our freedom and our democracy. And no one knows what's the direction up to now that this government is going to follow. It's a left government. The other part of the alliance, which was a right, center-right, has been marginated, sadly, and that is why we need a lot of support and almost all the world on top of the country so that we don't lose our democracy.
Thank you. Speaking of democracy, Mr. President, Colombia has one of the longest histories of democratic governance in the Western Hemisphere. Solid democracy. For 20 years, Colombians had three presidents, very different presidents, President Uribe, President Santos, and President Duque. And even though you had very different policies in many areas, economically, you had a period of tremendous stability. We're seeing now, same thing for Chile, for example, we're seeing now a series of uprisings throughout the Americas demanding a change in the system, right? We saw it in Chile with the referendum. We see it in Colombia with the government with the election of Petro. For a country that has been as successful as Colombia, why do we see these demands for change, for a different way of doing things, when things are not perfect in Colombia, but they're far better than most other Latin American countries?
Well, thank you, Carlos. Let me begin by a reflection about evidence-based politics. And if I may ask a question here at the Adam Smith Center, please feel free to raise the hands. Who are you, how many of you are familiar with Adam Smith? Please raise your hand. How many of you have heard about the invisible hand by Adam Smith? Okay. How many of you have heard that there's a theory of the hidden hand by Adam Smith? So then my question is, out of the 1 million words Adam Smith wrote or more in The Wealth of Nations, there's only one phrase where he talks about the invisible hand. But the common wisdom is that he built a theory that Márquez worked by an invisible hand. And I mention this because what happens in today politics sometimes is that evidence no longer matters as it should be. And it is sometimes quite difficult to understand how a country like Chile, that had the best performance in economic and social indicators, was brought to a situation in which the younger generations believed that nothing had been done in the last 3 decades, and that everything was in turmoil and that everything was wrong. And looking at the evidence, none of that was a reality. And then we tend to ask, how did people get so badly infuriated? And in the times we live, I believe that truth moves in a horse while post-truth moves in a rocket. And it is important to say that in the context of the democracies of Latin America. Because populism, post-truth, and polarization are 3 threats that are taking place in our democracies, and that's what happened in Chile. And yes, obviously people are willing to have changes constantly. And when you look at the periods of democracy in Chile since the fall of Pinochet, Chile has been mostly governed by leftist governments. And you saw great statesmen like Ricardo Lagos, who was from the left, but he was a true statesman. And he believed in fiscal responsibility, and he believed in sound social policies. Eduardo Frei. Or you can see even the first term of Michelle Bachelet was very moderate, and it was very much focused on results. But the new generations got the incubation that everything was wrong, and they got infuriated. And when you look at what has happened in Colombia, obviously we still have many challenges. Obviously we still have to close many social gaps. But still, when you look at what we have achieved in terms of expanding education coverage, healthcare coverage, the possibility of people to access higher education, the possibility of people to buy their own home and get the right subsidies and focalize the right way, I think those achievements are clear. But democracy has also been affected by these sentiments. Now, people are free to elect in the ballots, and I don't see catastrophic the idea that people from different ways of thinking might have a chance in politics, because as Thomas Jefferson used to say, when too much people think alike, there's not too much thinking going on. You have to be challenged by different ways of thinking. And obviously, the election of Petro was not something sudden. Petro has been in politics for 30 years, and he was mayor of Bogota, and he was in Congress for more than 20 years. And he had been 3 times a presidential candidate. I had him as my contender 4 years ago, and I defeated him with more than 2 million votes. Maybe in this election he didn't have a challenger who really was able to confront the ideas as maybe people expected, but that's another thing. So I think we have to see all this, but at the end what matters is that we need to have the culture of citizens in a democracy that need to take informated decisions.
And how do we do that? How do we get that?
So that's part of the things that I want to develop here at the fellowship, which is, where are the facts? How do we evaluate policies? And for example, some people in Colombia think that we have not been able to expand the social safety net as we should. In a country where only 5% of the population pay income tax. Only 5% of the Colombian population pays income tax. And we have been able to get the higher coverage of education in our history, and we have been able to create free higher education tuition for the upcoming middle class and the poorest of the poor. But people don't get that evidence. People get the information that everything is bad, that everything is wrong. So I think, how do we preserve democracy? We have to preserve democracy by ensuring that there is a fact-based discussion of policies and results. And I think if we don't do that, we're going to lose the most valuable thing of our democracy, which is that people are free to choose with good information. And maybe last but not least, I should say that when we look at what Colombia is facing today, I think we have to be able to find consensus. And I tried always to focus my policies not based on ideology, but based on a technocratic approach of what better serves the people. When you put too much ideology on policies, and you intervene prices, and you intervene the markets, and you distort the markets, you end up creating bigger messes. And I hope the new administration doesn't get into that territory, although I'm seeing some policies that are starting to create very complicated situations in the case of land. The Minister of Agriculture said openly that the land is not from the owners, but from the people that need it. And we have seen invasions of land in the last month like no time in the last 20 years. So I think this kind of discussions are very important, because it's not what people said in the ballots, is that you have to govern for the whole population. John F. Kennedy used to say that you can win with the 50%, but you cannot govern with the 50% against you. Thank you.
I'm going to ask a similar question to all 3 of you. I firmly believe that one of the biggest threats facing U.S. foreign policy is the Chinese threat. For about 40 years, right, there was consensus in the United States by Republicans and Democrats that the way to deal with the Chinese was to engage them, right, to bring them closer to us. Then comes President Trump and shatters that perception. What are we doing right and what are we doing wrong when it comes to the Chinese?
Well, I'm going to add something to it. I've been a strong believer that we needed to be cognizant of the fact that we are faced with great power competition, and we have a threat from China, but we have a threat from Russia. But these are different threats. China, definitively, the threat that's posed fundamentally from China has been an economic one. although China has been shoring up its military capability and capacity, which, by the way, the country that's assisting is Russia in this case. So predominantly. Russia, mind you, when most would say, well, it's not a threat, there's no challenge there. Russia clearly has proven time and again in so many cases that Putin is, you have domestically economic dire straits, so there's tremendous activism internationally, as we've witnessed. Syria, we witnessed before in Georgia, and Ukraine before, and Ukraine now, and I can go on. And even in terms of their actions, in terms of the stand countries in their sphere. The fact is, with Russia, Russia has nuclear weapons, and that's what undergirds its particular power base. What's significant here is, and to your question, we should be cognizant of and watching closely the kind of alignment between Russia and China. What do I mean by this? Politically, Putin and Xi Jinping have met something like almost 40 times now over these past years. They've made statements about how close their friendship is, number one. Secondly, economically, they also have been working very closely together. That's important for Russia because markets for Russia have been shut, like with its, and it has also by its own design. A number of years ago, it finally concluded a key energy pipeline with China, actually, and at a loss to Russia. But it did so because Putin already had in his mind what kind of manipulation he would put forward relative to the pipelines and energy sources into Western and Central, Western, Eastern Europe. Thirdly, we've seen they have collaborated on military exercises. And as I've said, the Russians have given actually the Chinese some key technology, and they've also collaborated on cyber, the cyber area. I can go on. It isn't purely just a marriage of convenience. I wouldn't call it a firm alliance, but I would say it bears close watching as an alignment. And the reason why is because both of those countries are united, especially against the United States. They do not want to see the United States to be a unipolar power. They do want to cut off our own influence across the globe, and they have really targeted it. But then secondly, they also have sought to fragment our relationships with our alliances and our partners. So that really bears watching. It is great power competition, which has become an organizing principle of foreign policy. And this relationship does bear watching. I'll end on this note. Having said all of that, sometimes the question comes up about, well, how do the two of them really work together? I'll say this. I think that Xi Jinping views Russia as junior. But by the way, Putin doesn't view himself as junior and would never, ever accept himself or Russia being a junior partner to China. And historically, they have had times of conflict and confrontation. So that's why I use the word alignment. But it does bear watching because it affects our own national security and that of our closest allies and partners.
Same question for both of you. As you know, the Chinese have this very ambitious program, the Belt and Road Initiative, that is spending billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure projects throughout the world. When I was in the government, in the U.S. government, we tried to persuade our friends and allies that they needed to come to the U.S. to make strategic alliances with the U.S., not with the Chinese. And what world leaders would tell me is that they get it, but they had seen the U.S. not be an active player in the region. They had seen a vacuum. And what they explain is that, well, my role as president is to provide for my people. And if the U.S. is absent, I'm going to go with the Chinese. How should Latin American leaders deal with the Chinese? And how do you get the U.S. more involved and fill this vacuum that really should be filled by the U.S. and not by the Chinese, for the two of you?
Yes, I consider that the greater democracy in the American continent is the democracy in the United States. This means that freedom is also important in the United States, probably not as much or so marked as in some European countries, but they protect freedom. There's freedom in the United States. As the ambassador was talking regarding Russia and China, I was trying to imagine how would the presence or control of Chinese and Russians in America would feel. Total different cultures, different political positions, different ways of thinking, no liberties. All of us know what happens in Russia with Putin, and all of us know what happens in China. I think that the United States, in first place, it's okay if the United States is supporting freedom in Ukraine and all over the world. But I think that the United States should pay more attention on what's going on in Latin America. There is a lot of poverty and a lot of insatisfaction in Latin America, and we have seen it in these last months with all those protests and all those movements. And I consider that a better strategy to support all these countries and these democracies and the freedom is needed by the United States. How? It depends on the will of its authorities, but I think that the United States should put in first place the peace and governance of Latin America.
Well, Paula has always been, for me, a reference model when it comes to diplomacy and understanding international relations. But I sometimes, Ambassador, have this reflection, and it is when we think about foreign policy theory, I truly believe in a constructivist world. And I mention this because Latin America basically followed the United States since 1973. I think it was wise when President Nixon decided to have a permanent engagement with China, and I think it was visionary, and I think it made a great contribution to the world. And once the United States recognized the People's Republic of China as the permanent member of the Security Council, many of the Latin American countries, with few exceptions, followed the same. And if there's one country in this hemisphere that has major Chinese investment, is the United States. And if there's one country in this hemisphere that has big trade with China, it's the United States. And if there's one country in the world who's a great holder of treasury bonds, is the People's Republic of China. So when you look at that, then why is it that we have to, in Latin America, be some type prisoners of this tension? Because I don't think we should be. And I think Colombia, for example, is the United States' #1 ally in the Western Hemisphere, and we share the democratic values we have, and we share law and order, and we share market economy. But we also have a trade relationship with China, and the same as the U.S., we have an increasing trade deficit that we have to close by exporting more. And that's a reality. And I never signed the Belt and Road, but we had a good relationship with China, and a lot of Chinese companies came and participated in bids in Colombia. And I remember that I participated in debates in think tanks in Washington or in Miami or in other places in New York, and people asked me, hey, why is it that there's so many Chinese investments coming to Colombia in the infrastructure sector? And I said, because they are participating in bids. And what worries me is that I'm not seeing American companies participate in those strategic bids. So they were not participating in the Bogota Metro. They were not participating in many of the biggest highways, fourth-generation highways. And that's just a fact. So when people ask me, you want to have Chinese investment? I say, yes, I want Chinese, American, Canadian, French, Belgian, wherever you want, as long as they fulfill and are are participating by the rules. So I say this because at the moment we are, with the inflation we face, with the complex logistical situation of the world, with a war derived by this brutal genocide from Russia in Ukraine, and also with the possibility of having a recession in early 2023, we cannot afford to be in a major trade war because this is going to harm the whole planet at this moment. So I say this because definitely I think we have to understand the values we share, but also the reality that we have already been engaged in trade with China. But there are differences. And one of those differences, I, as president, had to say it publicly, because there were a lot of Chinese companies that wanted to enter the telecommunications sector in Colombia. And I said, we don't have anything against Chinese corporations just for being Chinese. But we have to define which countries can ensure that if they participate in a sector, they will be respectful to the data, and they will protect the data, and they will protect the intellectual property. And I don't think there were companies from China that wanted to enter the sector that had those requirements, as happened with other countries. But we were clear in not to segregate, but to say which are the rules of the game. And I believe with those rules of the game, it is a decision from China whether they fulfill it or not. But the most complex thing at this moment is that I think we have to receive a lot more clarity. Because for some things in the United States, China is a partner, it's an ally, and in other cases, it's an enemy. And I don't think those kinds of signals are positive for Latin America. And I think if we get to solve this, I think we will have a better situation in the region, because now we call countries, wait, I'm very worried because China has become your number one trading partner. But this has happened for a decade. And it has happened for a decade because there has been engagement, even promoted by U.S. companies. But I see also the positive spectrum of this. Friendshoring and nearshoring. There are a lot of U.S. corporations that have to come to Latin America. The U.S. has realized that they don't want to be an uncertainty in Asia. Bring it here. Bring it here. And those investments can create opportunities. And I'll finish by saying that nearshoring and friendshoring are also solutions to protect the southern border of the United States in a constructive way. Because why do people want to risk their lives to cross the border? Why are there people willing to put everything in jeopardy just to cross the border? Because in moments of big devaluation, people want to multiply themselves by the exchange rate and be able to sell remittances back home. But if you have the investments, if you generate the jobs and you generate the opportunities in the countries, things will be much more different. And I believe that friendshoring and nearshoring can be more effective politically and diplomatically than the Belt and Road Initiative. Thank you.
May I just make just a
Yes.
quick comment? Because
Absolutely.
I can't help myself. I do want to say I'm in agreement with both of you. You both have made very important points. First, Madam Vice President, your point about the importance of the region and how crucial it is that we have policies formed that engage very actively the region. I mean, I viewed your comment as going beyond just, the economic lane, and just we should be looking and collaborating and be close. We have common agendas, so I couldn't agree more. And I do
Let me
think,
ask you about that, because you've been at the highest levels of U.S. government. Why aren't we more involved in Latin America?
well, I think that, candidly speaking, what drives foreign policy and national security is where there are direct threats. Okay, so when you look at Latin America, Venezuela and the situation between Colombia and Venezuela with the refugee flow, just also, bluntly speaking, the kind of terrorism that's also Iran's activities in Venezuela. I could go on. We're concerned about national security that drives an issue. But let me make the second point, which goes to your point, President Duque, and it's an important one. After the pandemic, it seemed to me that exactly what you're saying is what we should have moved on. I was no advocate ever of the kind of burgeoning trade with China. especially when there are so many opportunities, if I could say, in our neighborhood. I mean, for manufacturing, that American companies, were manufacturing these personal protective equipment, that then, like companies like Honeywell, they were blocked. The Chinese wouldn't let Honeywell export the protective, the mask and other equipment during the pandemic to us. So shouldn't we have immediately corrected that and started going back to, in fact, known manufacturing sites again in our neighboring countries and the neighborhood? So 100%, I couldn't agree more with what you've said. And I think that also adds just to the strength of our relationship and undergirds the faith in what brings us together in terms of democracy, freedom, and unity of purpose. But that has not been done, and I think it's a major mistake.
I'm going to ask you one more question for all of you, and then closing remarks, and then I'll turn it over to you. Ambassador, in your study group, you're going to talk about soft power. Many in the United States feel that foreign aid is a very important tool within our soft power toolkit, that we can use soft power and foreign aid in particular in very effective ways to make a difference in different parts of the world. Others believe that it's a waste of money. Why are we spending so much money? It's really not that much in terms of the budget, but the perception is that it's a lot of money. Why are we spending? Why are we giving money to countries that are corrupt? Where, as a member of the United States Senate, I believe, said, why are we taking money from poor people in a rich country, the United States, and giving it to rich people in poor countries? How do we structure our foreign policy making process so that foreign aid actually makes sense both for the United States and for other countries around the world?
Well, how do we structure it should be structured very carefully. and there isn't a cookie-cutter approach because it depends on individual countries in terms of what the situation is on the ground. Can one get aid in effectively and actually have a system of verifying and ensuring that it does get to its desired location? And also, by the way, at times many look at, the volume, the number, it's a large figure. By the way, that's not necessary. It could be a very small amount that could actually be a catalyst to big projects. What do I mean? I've dealt in the water area. And actually, I remember the Agency for International Development gave a loan to a community in India, Tamil Nadu. And the community itself had already determined exactly what kind of water project they wanted. They knew what made sense for their locality. And by the way, they not only took that loan and they were successful in the project, but they made money on the project. And they were able to repay the loan. And then they, as I said, they made more money on it. That's one example. I'm going to give one more. I went during my tenure as Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. I went actually more times to Afghanistan and Asia than I did ever to Europe. And I did go a lot to Latin America, especially to Colombia during my tenure, as President Duque knows. So, but Afghanistan is the one that I want to mention to you. I remember one of the first meetings in Afghanistan. We met with two women who actually were out of Mazar-i-Sharif, and they came and they said, we have a request of you. We want a loan, and what we want is just a micro loan so that we could start our own business, and we'll pay it back. The next time I came back to Afghanistan, I was so impressed. We met with close to 80 women who had all kinds of businesses. The kite business. One had believe it or not, a cement store, or a cement factory, I should call it that. Wood, carpentry, furniture, just so many different types of areas that they went into. And this was the most humorous part. They actually formed a federation because they felt they needed to. Well, at the time, AID was so impressed with their resolve, their entrepreneurship, that actually they did give some seed money to them. And forgive me for gentlemen in the room, but actually then the men wanted to have a unified federation. And the women said, no, we're not going to do that. We had asked you before to join, and you said no. and we were able to put it together ourselves. So simply put, just two examples, it doesn't have to be a lot of money. You do have to know who you're giving it to on the ground. I do think targeted aid makes a difference, but it's targeted aid, not just random amounts of money that might go to projects that don't have an effect. Or
Should there be
impact.
strings attached to that aid?
We do believe in conditional aid. And by the way, speaking of China, China doesn't have, quote unquote, on the surface conditional aid, but they come back to you and they put the noose around your neck. Right. It's not so obvious up front. But many Caribbean countries have spoken to this issue, how they dislike the Chinese approach and they regret taking Chinese money for hotels and infrastructure. But to your question, yes, there has to be conditionality. There should be metrics to show that there was actual progress and that you know where the money exactly went, 100%.
Same question for the both of you. How would you like the U.S. to structure its foreign aid? How can the U.S. ensure that foreign aid is going not only to advance projects that promote economic development in your countries, but that also makes sense for the United States?
Yes, at least in Honduras or probably Central America, it would be very valuable that the United States supports our countries in how to fight corruption in first place. In the other hand, how to fight in a transparent way organized crime, drug trafficking. With those two things and by bringing investments to our country, I think that Honduras will be very grateful and probably we can see the sun again shine.
I have a sense of tremendous gratitude with the United States because when we evaluate what has happened in Colombia in the last 22 years, we can begin by saying that in 1999, there was this edition of Foreign Policy magazine that had, for the first time, the index of failed states. And Colombia was not in the area of failed states, but it was at the brink. And after months of that edition, Plan Colombia was approved. And Plan Colombia in the last 20 years has been a very supportive tool that has allowed Colombia to fight terrorism, to fight narco-trafficking, to strengthen the law and order institutions, and also to go hand in hand with USAID interventions in multiple areas, whether it's land reform, whether it's land titling, whether it's supporting the migrants, whether it is generating aggregated value chains with peasants and in complicated areas of the country. So I think there has been a major change. And if I may say, I think the biggest diplomatic success of the United States in the Western Hemisphere, and I should say maybe Paula, maybe in multiple parts of the world, has been Plan Colombia. And what made Plan Colombia so special is that it was bipartisan and bicameral. And that it began with President Clinton, it had a next phase with President Bush, it was strengthened by President Obama, it continued with President Trump, and is now in place with President Biden with the mutations that we have seen in all the administrations. Right? There's consistency, and there's that sense that what matters is the relationship. So I think that has been a major success. And I felt it as president when I had to face, for example, this massive migration coming from Venezuela. The United States was there with resources and with support. We could have not granted the temporary protection status to almost 2 million Venezuelans without the support of the United States. We received support from other countries. But I should say, two of the most worrisome things that I saw in international cooperation is that when it comes to major crises like the migration crisis, a lot of pledges, few disbursements. Like everybody pledges, and all their roundtables. It's like I've been in, dozens of roundtables with many pledges, but then the disbursements don't move at the same pace. And the other thing that I saw, and the United States made a difference. The United States said, I'm going to put money, the money was there. And the other thing is what I call the the best fashion shows, because that's another thing that happens in times of crisis. You start seeing the best from cooperation agency number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and they all want to have their own micro project with their own consultants from the country of origin, and that's simply insane in order to face something that has to be expanded and that requires to be escalated and to be massive. So I see Colombia as a success case of what the United States has been able to do. But now I think that the other great important challenge is FDIC. So USAID, for me, has been one of the most powerful tools of the United States. But I believe that now it has to be more integrated with FDIC, particularly focusing FDIC more to finance private sector endeavors that are aimed to generate employment and opportunities. I believe that friendshoring, nearshoring requires FDIC. And I believe that bringing long-term credit from the United States, even for U.S. companies to invest in Latin America, can be a very important soft diplomacy instrument that can make a difference. That's my take there.
And I would agree that Plan Colombia has been one of the most successful foreign policy plans in the region. One of the leading voices in the U.S. Congress at the time was Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, one of our first, or part of our first cohort of fellows. And many argue that we need a Plan Latin America that is similar to what we did in Colombia with other Latin American countries. All right, so let's turn it over to you. So I'm going to ask if you have any questions. I want to begin with the students first. And have the microphones? We use these? Okay. And since the questions are not going to be for me, I'm going to give mine to the ambassador.
Oh, okay. I was gonna-
All right. We might not be able to do all of them, but we'll try as many. Go for it.
Sure.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your time. My name is Elias Castilla Márquez. I am a senior. I am originally from Barranquilla, Colombia. So naturally, my question will go to President Duque. Let's talk about facts. The facts of your legacy are that you left Colombia as a top performing economy in the region. You were able to expand, as you said, Colombia's safety nets, especially during the pandemic. We saw it through programs like Ingreso Solidario. And you were able to bring critical topics to the table that Colombia had never touched on before, like climate change. Somehow, these facts were outpaced by the post-truth that you were talking about that moves in a rocket. How do we build a even faster rocket for the real truth? And how do we make sure that we fill in that vacuum, that power vacuum that we've left in the cultural scene throughout Latin America? Thank you.
Well, Elias, thank you so much. And I believe that facts speak by their own. Has always been my sense. And especially when you look at the most challenging crisis of our lifetime, that was COVID-19. And actually, sometimes it feels like COVID was never there because things move very fast today. But we were in a moment where the economies were shut down. And for the first time in 200 years, I had to shut down the country. And in an isolation that was trying to be managed in a reasonable way. And we only were able to close 40% of the economy, but then start bringing it up. And we launched the equivalent of our New Deal. We got the economy growing. We lowered unemployment. We lowered multidimensional poverty. And at the same time, we created programs that passed from 4 million households receiving government attention to almost 11 million households. Without that program, we would have lost everything we did in the last 2 decades. But then you think, people will understand it. And then you see all this guerrilla tactics applied to disruptive, polarized, and fake news-based messaging, in which what matters is the trend and the demonization of sectors and the memes and all those things that are part of today's culture, but we are the ones who are allowing that to happen. So let me say this. We have sometimes debates in our society about trash food. What about trash news? What about trash information? What about trash sources? And I think we have to put that into the mind of citizens, because those are the things we consume. Trash information, trash news, and trash manipulation of facts, in my opinion, are criminal. There are people sometimes that get so infuriated that can put the life of others in danger because of the things they've put there, and try to make that lie a truth by growing it exponentially. But that requires a great response from citizens. And one day I remember that in a family with my wife and the kids, we saw this documentary that came out about social media in Netflix, the social media dilemma. I don't know if you have seen it. If you've not seen it, you should see it, because it tells you about the manipulation of the algorithms. And that now when you consume and you start consuming trash, everything you will receive is the same trash, because it's already inside what you're looking for. So I believe that debate about trash sources of information and not factual-based information is one of the biggest dangers in our democracies. So we should put that ethical debate, and we should be able to rank. And we should be able to say, as we have done it with trash food, this food is unhealthy. We should also be able to allow citizens to have independent ways of ranking those trashy sources of information that are not based on facts and just want to destroy the real facts that are benefiting the people.
Great. We have a question here, and I'm going to ask you to follow Elias's model. Say your name, where you're from, and remember that questions end in a question mark.
Thank you very much. My name is Leia Arboleda. I'm a third-year law student here at FIU. And my question is a broad, general one. Among what everyone was speaking and saying, it came into my attention that with the polarization that's going on with the world, it's difficult to find out who to be led by, correct? And especially since all the changes that have been happening in the U.S. as well, with the changes of previous foreign policies of abridging maybe relationships with South America through TPP, or maybe the climate change accord that was bridged as well and then came back into place. With those bridges that were burned temporarily, how can then South American, Latin American, and then the U.S. overall come back into play as a main player and then a leader as it was before, as in the plan that successfully play out in Colombia? How can they do that again, but in current times, with the polarization that even in the country has been evident now leading forward to other countries?
I'll begin on this. I was used to that mic. I'll begin on this. Forgive me. I think that first, the United States, as I had indicated earlier, I believe the United States should be active internationally and engaged. I'm part of a coalition that's been formed. It's called the Vandenberg Coalition. It's named after Senator Vandenberg, who was well known for promoting U.S. engagement abroad. Engagement, I'm not talking about being engaged in wars, but talking about how you forge partnerships, by the way, to counter threats. For example, the United States is part of the Indo-Pacific, the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. This was initiated by Japan. Shinzo Abe, who passed, was assassinated tragically. He initiated it back in 2007. It's the United States, Australia, India, and Japan. And what is its purpose? It's come together to forge a kind of military framework to counter the Chinese threat. So one, diplomatically, we should be much more assertive and play a leadership role. Secondly, that doesn't mean, by the way, that the United States is putting its blood and treasure into different cases. Here, I do think that during the time of the Trump administration, Trump pushed very hard on this issue about NATO and the shared spending. By the way, every single administration tried to get Europe to come up and to pay its share and was not successful. I think it took those kinds of threats and kind of bringing it to the brink in this case. And now it's even more prominent because of Russia's aggression and war on Ukraine. So that's a second of alliances where it's not just only us, but where there is this collaboration. Let me mention a third that I don't think we've hit upon here, and that is the importance of our moral values, which undergird everything that we do. Why does that matter? I think that there was a real complacency. And I think that we weren't very proactive in unifying others toward that common goal and end. And that requires leadership, it requires engagement, it requires not just a speech or two at the presidential level in the United States, but it requires activism. And that's just like in the context of mentioning Latin America. You don't just say, well, you're our friends, you have to be there, you have to be present, and you have to also demonstrate it in terms of shift of policy, like in the trade area. So I think that tragically, I think we've moved away, and my simple answer to you is we just have to move back. And it requires that kind of leadership quality and vision to do it. And especially because we are an environment, as I said earlier to your question, Carlos, we are an environment of great power competition. And China, as the Vice President said earlier, well, you know, you're not there and they're there. Well, that's absolutely right. If we're not there and we're not active and engaged, vacuums are filled. And we need to be thinking about how economically, politically, militarily, and in terms of alliances and coalitions, that we are unified as countries that care about values, that care about freedom, the Economic Freedom Center, freedoms across the board.
Let's do two more questions on this side, and then we'll jump to the other side.
Can I
Absolutely.
add just something? Because I want to put it into an anecdote or a story that has always been said about management. And that's why your question about dealing with polarized environments. And the thing is that today, most of people who govern are tempted by demonizing in order to being one of both sides of the extremes. There was this guy who used to run a company who retired and appointed as his successor his vice president. And so he told him, you know, I love you, you have been like a son to me, so I'm gonna leave a drawer in the drawer of your desk. I'm gonna leave 3 envelopes. One says number 1, number 2, and number 3. When you have your first crisis, you open number 1. When you have your second crisis, you open number 2. And when you have your third crisis, you open number 3. So he retired and his successor took office. And then, first crisis, and the board was shaky, so he opens envelope number 1. Advice, blame your predecessor. So he goes to the board of directors and he says, you know, this has gone very bad, this has gone rogue, you know, the information we had was not so clear, and so the board said, okay, continue. Second crisis, the guy opens the envelope and he says, blame the government. So this company is very well run, but these decisions from the government just are horrendous. So the board said, okay, continue. Then he had his third crisis. And he opens the envelope and it said, write 3 letters. Why this is important is because most of the important decisions about Plan Colombia were thinking on the best interest of the United States and of the best interest of Colombia. And that kind of thinking should not be lost. Where are the moments of Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan? Where are the moments of Bill Clinton and Dennis Hastert with Plan Colombia, among other moments? We have to be able to solve in the United States in a bipartisan way migration decisions, climate change decisions, trade decisions. And the new generations have also to think about that kind of bridging both sides of the aisle. If that is lost continuously, I think it would only benefit the autocrats who want to derail the United States democracy. If there is the possibility to bridge back again bipartisan, bicameral solutions, I think that strengthening of the U.S. democracy will be the best and most effective response to the autocrats that want to affect this democracy.
Great. All right.
It's okay. Hi, my name is Bella. I'm a junior, and my question is for Mrs. Dobriansky. First of all, my mom's family is also Ukrainian, so that's something that we have in common. But my question is actually about American foreign policy towards Latin America. So as we all know, the United States does not engage in diplomatic ties with countries that overtly commit human rights violations, such as the regimes that you already stated, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. However, there are countries, specifically in Latin America, that actually commit covert human rights violations that could be engaging with drug organizations, taking drug money, or even limiting the free speech of their population. So my question for you is, where does the United States draw the line with engaging with countries that commit human rights violations? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with this. Actually, there are many countries that we deal with who commit human rights violations, but yet it's necessary to do so because of national security concerns. I look at the Middle East, if I could say. We know very well the case is played out in the paper in Saudi Arabia, the brutal murder of Khashoggi. So we engage Saudi Arabia because Iran is a major threat, not just to our own concerns, but to others. Iran backs proxies, terrorist proxies, and when we even witness when in the Trump administration, the Iranian general was taken out, Soleimani. I know there was controversy in the human rights, in the foreign policy community. Personally, I thought it was the right thing to do because, by the way, he murdered countless American men and women servicemen. Here, the answer is that first, you said, where do we draw the line? We do look at what are those practical steps that need to be taken in order to advance national security interests. But we also combine that with ensuring that there is either a dialogue or there is a spotlighting of human rights abuses and a desire to try to sanction. You use various foreign policy tools and instruments in order to apply pressure. The point is you just don't go on one track and ignore the other. You have to deal with both simultaneously and in a very direct way. I worked in the Human Rights Bureau at the State Department when it was still the Soviet Union. It hadn't broken up yet. And by the way, we pushed actually to have a human rights dialogue. The Russians at the time, Moscow, refused to actually even take the list that we had of political prisoners. But yet, by the way, simultaneously, we were also engaging on nuclear weapons and arms talks in that area. And there were discussions at the head of state level. So you have to move forward. You have to think about how you deal with all of these elements in the most effective way possible. But we never let human rights issues just go by the wayside. There is the Human Rights Report, which we use. We have public statements, presidential statements, et cetera.
So one more on this side, and then we'll jump over to the other side.
My name is Carlos Jose Santiago. I just want to thank you guys for taking our time today and answering questions and giving us all this insight. I'm a second year here at FAU majoring in political science. I'm also part of the Model United Nations program, and this question could go for either of you if you would like to answer, and specifically it kind of ties back to what President Duque was saying about misinformation. I believe being misinformed is one of the biggest problems that our society globally has. And considering misinformation, my question is, when it comes to news reports or things coming from Washington, for example, or politicians talking about For example, China, as we discussed for a long time, the People's Republic of China. Specifically, it kind of reminds me of the Cold War when we had the whole Red Scare, and there was a lot of headlines about communism and everything with that. So my question is, when it comes to being misinformed about the Chinese problem, would you say that these type of headlines, in terms of the Chinese problem or the Chinese threat, only aids in the exasperation of a problem that I believe, in my opinion, isn't really a big of a threat as we think it is in terms of a global hegemon, if any one of you could answer that? Thank you very much.
Well, that's a,
Why don't you?
no, I would say that the first thing is that we have to cut the hypocrisy. And I'm saying this worldwide because the whole world accepted China to become a member of the UN Security Council being a one-party system and having all the restrictions to the exercise of liberties. And I think there was a broad consensus that no one should impose the concept of Western democracy to China. And I say this because, obviously, we are true believers in democracy. I'm a true believer in democracy, and I don't believe that there can be capitalism without individual liberties. So countries that are allowed to have investment and startups without those freedoms, in my opinion, they shouldn't be called capitalist. They could be called capital-friendly, entrepreneurial-friendly if you want. But they're not capitalist countries. So we have seen an evolution in China. And the United States had a very close relationship with Deng Xiaoping, with Jiang Zemin, with Hu Jintao, and they have had a good relationship or a relationship with Xi Jinping. But what has now changed the direction of this is that Xi Jinping is the first, stronger leader, maybe since the time of Mao, that has now going to project for a longer period in time. And this is also generating major debates. But I believe that what we cannot do is now to demonize what the Western accepted for such a long time. Now, do I agree with the policies of liberty restrictions? No, not whatsoever. But I respected throughout a long term of policy that there was an engagement, a trade relationship, so on and so forth. Now, can we trust information coming out of China? Do we have sources that will tell us something that is absolutely credible? I don't think so. We never got sound information about COVID. We don't have good information about what's going on with the real estate situation, and it can become a worldwide mess. And I don't think we're going to solve that because that is fully controlled by the Chinese government, and they're not going to allow information to flow that puts in jeopardy the weaknesses of the system. Now, can there be other sources around the world that can try to understand and to go to the weeds about what's going on in China? I hope yes. And I think there are some media outlets that have been taking this seriously. But can we solve the misinformation or truth about what's going on in China in many sectors? I don't think that's going to happen. And can we change that? I don't think that can be changed unless the government of China were run by the rules of Western democracies where there is a true independence of power and the media. And I think we have to be practical unless we really want to be absolutely discouraged, because this is not going to have an easy solution.
I'll just
Sorry for being so practical on that and so blunt.
I'll just have a brief addition. I believe that how a country's leadership treats its own people is a reflection of also how it engages more broadly in the international community. And in my view, the communist system of China has repressed actual creativity. You have massive poverty throughout the rural areas. The elites benefit, but the rural areas do not. Separate from COVID, by the way, during my tenure as undersecretary, we dealt with avian influenza. And actually, China was the only country, separate from North Korea, which we didn't ask to go into North Korea to investigate. China would not permit any international organizations from coming in to actually test the birds for bird flu at the time. I'm sorry to say that kind of action, I think, bodes not well. There are all kinds of threats. Some cast health issues as a threat. And by the way, health issues have destabilized countries, have provoked wars. So I don't know, I see it a little bit differently. Right now, the biggest debate in the foreign policy community is, and I think it's correct, how we handle Ukraine will also be sending signals, certainly to the Chinese regime and how they're going to deal with Taiwan. And Taiwan is democratic. Taiwan is economically a powerhouse, has done very, very well. In fact, years ago, it was actually had overtaken China, and it was stronger in terms of the figures. That has changed. But the bottom line is that you can't have economic growth if freedoms are suppressed. And you said that in your own opening. And that just goes to the heart of it. So I do think that a threat is posed to all of us when you have a regime that does not tell the truth, that also hacks into other countries and systems and destabilizes. It's problematic. But by the way, I do want to say this, if I can. President Duque mentioned a number of times, and I want to underscore this. I'm in total agreement with him when he mentions that how it's crucial that you have to, particularly in the bipartisan sense you mentioned, to engage. And it's interesting, on this question of China, by the way, it is one of the most bipartisanly embraced issues in the United States, where there really is a great harmony. Yes, one of the few, China and Ukraine, actually.
Time for two more questions.
Thank you. And thank you for offering this program. It's okay, I'm not going to fall. My name is Tony Costa. I'm just a freshman here. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm a graduate from University of Florida. I'm sorry, guys. I am perplexed, it's getting serious now, with the war and the invasion of Russia of Ukraine. And I'm glad that you seem to be, or probably are, an expert in Ukraine. And I'm perplexed because we find that as horrendous and unprovoked that invasion has been, we have countries in this hemisphere that are allies and supporting the war unconditionally, mainly Cuba, and Nicaragua, Venezuela, and others in other parts of the world, obviously. But I do travel to Washington from time to time, and I'm perplexed. The fact that there's this saying that stayed with me, I don't know who gave it to me, but it says, the friend of your enemy is your enemy. And we are not recognizing that fact in the State Department, the White House, or the rest of the administration. And we're treating Cuba and Venezuela. We even have a $15 million on Maduro, and we send somebody to talk to him. I don't know. I get confused. So maybe you can help me.
Well, you have every right to be confused. I thought it was absurd that the administration sent a delegation to talk to Maduro about energy, resolving energy issues. I mean, I would never have sent off such a diplomatic team. And it was no surprise that it was an absolute failure. Why would Maduro actually engage? And actually, it was an opportunity for Maduro to show that, well, the United States, correct, I'm strong, and I can just squash you. So not a good diplomatic play at all. 100%. And certainly, you know, if I can take your comment, though, it's not surprising the position of Cuba. It's not surprising to me the position of Nicaragua or Venezuela with regard to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But the challenge for us are the countries where we have strategic partnerships that actually have abstained on UN votes or have not come out as strongly as they want. And this goes to an issue that President Duque mentioned earlier about how we have to deal and navigate these kinds of sensitive issues. A country that personally I think is a very important and strategic one in Asia to us and a counterweight to China is India. India, by the way, I don't know if you know, but their number one arms sales comes from Russia, by the way. And so India also is getting its energy supply from Russia, okay, during this period. So the question for us is, do we impose secondary sanctions and take actions against countries that are you know, that we're friends with? That's that agree to disagree on some practicalities that exist, and how do you get around that? And that's a great challenge right now. I have to say that there have been some other countries like Turkey that has also played a very interesting role as a NATO ally, you know, a member of NATO in this case. I did take note of Erdogan's statement to Putin that Crimea is not yours. But was that just really because he cared about Crimea, or was that because he's teeing up his own agenda relative to the Kurds? And also, you know, the situation and the concern that Turkey has about the Kurds and how they see what is part of Turkey from their perspective. So you raised an important question. I'll simply say this goes back to kind of a strategic approach. I valued the time, and if I may make one more statement, I valued the time when I worked in the Reagan administration. And I think back on that often, because you had 2 terms. And during the first term, the Soviet Union was categorized as the evil empire. Reagan launched what was known as Star Wars. It was the Ballistic Missile Defense Initiative, which, by the way, you see later writings from Moscow. They were very concerned about that announcement and what we were going to do. But then you also saw in the second term how he engaged Gorbachev and was agile and flexible enough, and that's what you were trying to say, in his leadership approach. I don't see us as agile and flexible and actually taking a strong principled stance where we should and calling a spade, and then providing that room when it's warranted. And certainly you're absolutely right in the case of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, no. The answer is no. There's nothing warranted there, without a doubt.
I want to add something, Paula, because you have been a strong voice, and I know the family ties and the life ties with Ukraine. I was one of the few voices in Latin America who blasted Putin out when this genocide began, and even before that. But I have just one thing that I clearly don't understand. The only one thing that Vladimir Putin feels as something that hurts really to Russia is the oil supply. And first question to be asked, has Russia cut oil exports in the last 210 days? The response is no. So have they benefited of the spike in the oil price out of the mess they created? The response is yes. What could have been done more effectively to cut the exports? But what would have happened if that would have been the case? Then 6 million barrels per day would not have been put on the market, and in 10 days after that occurs, they will have to shut down the oil fields because they don't have any reserve capacity to contain such a volume, and that would have hurt him. I mean, that would have taken him, it would have cost all of us, but I'm pretty much sure that that would have had a solution in 30 days because there's no way he could have handled that. So, in my opinion, sometimes we see all this major world hypocrisy with two elements of complexity. I spoke with President Zelensky, and I think he's a hero. But if I were in his shoes, I would be asking myself, am I going to get to the EU? Then everybody says, yes, but not now. I'm going to get to NATO? Maybe, but not now. Am I going to get to the OECD? Yes, but not now. So all the effective policy responses to this brutality and this genocide that would have been more vocal and more crucial, including Ukraine, in those places where Vladimir Putin threatened for them not to be, that would have been a very strong world response. And that has not happened.
It takes strong leadership, and we have not witnessed strong, principled leadership. The fact is, energy. By the way, you mentioned the cutting of the exports, but I would add, actually, my personal view is we should actually change our energy policy, because, as they say in Texas, open up the spigots. I negotiated climate change. But I'm sorry to say, we can deal with these issues and be have climate stewardship, but here, absolutely, it would definitely have a dire impact. It would help our allies, and we're not doing it. And then I mentioned the military. I have to say that one again. The letter that I and a number of others, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, signed, actually, the war doesn't have to go on if that equipment, and I'm not talking about just drones and ammunition, howitzers, we're talking about aircraft, actually, here. If long-range, multiple launch rocket systems were given to the Ukrainians earlier on, by the way, this war, I believe, would have been won by the Ukrainians. We wouldn't have dragged out. So decisiveness, taking a position. But I use the word escalation, and if you remember when you asked me the question, what's going on, I also referenced back to 2014. That was the Obama-Biden administration. They didn't give arms to Ukraine, and they told them not to fight. So Ukrainians remember that in Ukraine. And they were going to get arms any way they could, whether it was from the US or not. And then secondly, they were 100% going to fight. And anyone who thinks that even if Russia has some success, bluntly speaking, I'll just tell you this, even if Russia has some success, the fact is that insurgency will go on. They're going to continue waging that war.
Right here, middle? There we go, go for it.
Hi, my name is Elisette, and I'm a sophomore here at FIU. And my question is for President Duque. So I also really like quotes, and Einstein has stated that repeating the same thing over and over again and expecting different results can be considered insanity. When speaking on the so-called war on drugs, when looking at the facts that an increase in military spending did not solve the issue of drugs in Colombia, and I am critical of politicians and leaders, when you were a leader in Colombia, violent crimes actually increased, and they have been at an all-time high. If peace is so important for Colombia, and if that is the end goal, then why is the opposition to Petro's drug policies when the approaches of presidencies before him have not succeeded such acclaimed peace?
Well, I love the question, Elisa, and thank you so much. And I think the most valuable thing about the question is to look at the facts. So let me begin by something you said. During my administration, violent crimes increased. That's not true. And I can clearly describe it this way. Homicide rate in Colombia. When you look at the average of the homicide rate of my administration, it was 25.2 per 100,000 inhabitants, average my whole administration. That's the lowest homicide rates in a presidential term in 40 years. The same thing has happened with kidnappings. We reached the lowest kidnapping rate since the moment we started facing that horrible crime. So I say this not to say everything is beautiful, no, but the accuracy about the way we dealt with homicides, that's the number. Now, do I believe that more can be done? Yes, obviously yes. And on the war on drugs, first of all, I don't like the term war, because this is a holistic problem. And the first policy that I approved while being president after the Peace with Legality policy was we call the Ruta Futuro policy. That is a 360 policy that tackles every element and had two very important changes. First, to decriminalize consumption. The first Colombian president to decriminalize consumption was me, because I said, we have to seize the drugs. What we cannot do is a consumer in the streets trial him as if he was a drug dealer. And we did it. And we introduced the first public policy health care attention for addicts as part of the Ruta Futuro. But we also said something. We had to contain the exponential growth of illegal crops. When Plan Colombia began, we had 189,000 hectares of coca, and they were brought to 50,000 by the year 2015. Once the aerial spray policy was stopped during the President Santos administration between 2015 and 2018, it passed from 50,000 hectares to almost 209,000 hectares. So the first thing that I had to do was to contain the exponential growth, and we did it with manual eradication, and we tried to use the concept of precision aerial spray, and we didn't get a clear approval from the Constitutional Court. Now, saying that, the seizures of drugs last year were 670 tons of cocaine, the highest seizures ever. And we have cooperation from the FBI, from the DEA, from the Border Patrol, from Homeland Security. But the one thing that has to be changed in the way we face drugs is that we can clearly do much cutting the supply. But the thing is that nobody is doing absolutely anything to cut the demand. And in 2020, during the pandemic, the consumption of cocaine spiked like no other time in the past. And the last time there was a public policy campaign in the United States about creating awareness of not consuming was Nancy Reagan Say No to Drugs. Nothing besides that has happened since then in terms of doing something that is persuasive to society about why it's wrong for the health and for the system. But something else. Nobody has ever put on the table the environmental damage of cocaine. Cocaine, in order to be produced, for 1 hectare of coca to be grown, 2 hectares of tropical jungle are destroyed. And nobody's saying that. It's an ecocide. In order to produce 1 kilo of cocaine, 10 gallons of gasoline are used, which is like pumping an SUV every time you produce a kilo of cocaine. And most of the chemicals that are used to produce cocaine are buried in the jungles. So the most damageable drug in the world when it comes to the effects on climate, on nature, and biodiversity is cocaine. And we have said it. So it's maybe legalization the solution? So legalizing cocaine, I'll tell you what can happen. You legalize cocaine in a country, in a developing country, when you have an addict in a family, it destroys the family. People don't have the capacity to afford public health care attention to that kind of situation. And in a country like the United States, let me just ask, is the United States willing to afford to have cocaine in the streets while at the same time you have the capacity to buy weapons like if you were going to Walmart and buy groceries? Imagine what kind of a problem it would create. And the other thing is that cocaine generates automatic addiction. It is something that you consume and it produces a negative brain effect. And if you consume it a lot, it is absolutely reversible. So if you had legalization of cocaine, what you will have is a spike in the people that will ask for public health care attention within 6 months or a year. And the question is, who's going to pay for that? So are you going to charge the taxpayers more money to attend that? In what magnitude? So I like speeches, And I like speeches that can get a lot of applauses. But what happens with politicians that embrace this just to please the crowd is that they don't have neither the evidence nor the facts, nor they have the roadmap about how is it that they're going to attend this differently. And I'm not biased ideologically about this. If somebody can prove me with evidence that things will be much better, that people will not be harmed, and that society would absolutely put an end to the violence derived from that, I'll be the first one to support it. But people have never asked about the counterfactual of being able to control a massive movement of cocaine around the world. So I really like the question, Elisa, and I think these are the kind of questions that we should have, not only in my work as a scholar, but here inside the university. Because, you know, good speeches and speeches that can get a lot of applauses, they're all over the place. But it is the evidence, the facts, and the roadmap about what's feasible, what I really believe matters to an academic environment. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And these are, thank you. These are exactly the types of questions that students will be able to ask of our fellows. Now you can see why I'm so excited to welcome them. Each of them will be teaching study groups that have 8 sessions each. If you're a student at FIU, you can go to our webpage, freedom.fiu.edu, and sign up for the study groups. Before we go, in 1 minute or less, I want to ask each of our fellows to let us know what keeps them up at night, whether it's something in their countries or something around the world. What keeps you up at night, Ambassador? Ukraine.
I think I indicated that.
Madam Vice President?
Corruption.
Corruption. Mr. President?
Democracy and the threats to democracy.
Great. Thank you all so very much. Thank you.